The sea was eerily calm as John White's ship approached the shores of Roanoke, a cursed place. Last time they settled here, all those years ago, the people that were supposed to be waiting for them upon arrival had disappeared. The only welcoming party was a pile of human bones. Now, he was making his way back for a second time. He had been haunted by the thought of what had become of his family and the settlers he'd left behind on August 27, 1587, 3 long years ago. As the island came into view, his heart pounded with anxious anticipation. But then, a flicker of hope appeared on the horizon. From deep within the forest, a thin column of smoke rose up into the sky, a sign of life, something the island hadn't shown when he and the other settlers first arrived all those years ago. As White and his crew ventured inland, they noticed fresh footprints, evidence that someone had been here recently. And yet, there was no trace of the settlers, no bodies, no signs of struggle, no graves. Just one clue. A single word carved into a wooden post. CROATOAN. Just that one cryptic word, as if left there specifically for him, waiting for 3 long years. Nearby, 3 more letters, CRO, were carved into a tree. It was as if they were trying to write CROATOAN but had to flee. Yet still, there were no signs of danger. So was it a code for something else then? Had the settlers left willingly, or had something far more sinister happened? To this day, the fate of 117 colonists remain one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. But now, new evidence has surfaced, clues that could finally uncover the truth. Let's dive into the stories, the theories, as well as the new clues, and try to shed light to the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke. It was 1584, and colonization was the hottest new trend sweeping through Europe. England's Queen Elizabeth I, eager to expand her empire, set her sights on an untamed land across the Atlantic. She turned to a man she trusted, a decorated soldier, an explorer, and, as some would say, a poet at heart. Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh wasn't just any soldier. He was sharp, ambitious, and, by all accounts, quite the dashing figure. Perhaps that was why Queen Elizabeth I favored him, entrusting him with an endeavor that would prove vital in strengthening England's expansion. That said, Raleigh couldn't have known that this mission would set the stage for one of history's most perplexing mysteries. On April 27, 1584, Raleigh sent an exploratory mission led by Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow. Their goal? To determine whether this so-called New World was worth the risk. What they found was promising: vast resources, fertile land, and a location ideal for military strategy. They also encountered 2 Native American tribes, the CROATOAN and the CROATOAN, with whom they built a cordial relationship with before sailing back to England. The report convinced Raleigh this land was worth taking. At the time, it wasn't yet called Roanoke. Raleigh had initially named it Virginia in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen. A bold tribute or an obsessed fanboy moment? You decide, but to avoid confusion, we'll stick with calling it Roanoke. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh sent 600 men under the command of his cousin Sir Richard Grenville with Ralph Lane to act as governor once the settlement was established. On paper, it seemed like just another routine colonization, except with a greater promise of reward at the end. That is, until the problems began. During the journey, storms battered their fleet, scattering their ships and forcing them to stop for repairs. When they finally reached the Outer Banks, disaster struck. Their flagship, Tiger, ran aground, destroying most of their already limited food supply. Despite these ominous setbacks, Grenville successfully established a settlement on Roanoke Island before returning for England, taking most of the men with a promise to come back with supplies and another wave of settlers. Lane and about 100 men remained behind, constructing a fort and depending on trade with local tribes for food. In return, they supplied the indigenous people with European goods such as metal tools, copper kettles, and glass beads, highly prized items among the native Roanoke population. This arrangement was meant to sustain them until Grenville returned with additional supplies. At first, everything seemed to be falling into place, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered, and the storm was just on the horizon. Governor Lane began to take an excessively aggressive stance against the indigenous tribes. Relations soared around this time. Then came the breaking point. Out of desperation and paranoia, Lane led an attack on the Secotun tribe, which he believed was plotting against the English settlers. During the assault, one of his men killed their chieftain. The response was swift. The other tribes cut off food supplies, leaving the settlers to fend for themselves. To make matters worse, Grenville's resupply mission had yet to arrive. the colony was running out of time. By June 1586, starvation and desperation forced the settlers to make a choice: leave Roanoke or perish. Fortune, however, smiled upon Lane and his men when Britain's famed naval hero and explorer, Sir Francis Drake, arrived. He was in the midst of a privateering expedition against the Spanish and had been sailing northward along the American coast when he reached Roanoke Island. There, he found Lane and his regiment desperate, starving, but still alive. He offered them passage back to England, and they gladly accepted. Abandoning the colony, they sailed home in defeat. Grenville did return to Roanoke a few weeks later with the resupply and more men, having taken a detour for a little privateering of his own. Upon arrival, he was met with an abandoned settlement. Strangely enough, records indicate that Lane left no note or message explaining their departure. With no sign of colonists, Grenville had little choice but to leave. However, he stationed 15 soldiers and left behind a year's worth of rations to maintain England's claim to the region. Thus, England's first attempt at colonizing Roanoke ended in failure. But the story doesn't finish here, because when the English returned to Roanoke a year later, something truly eerie awaited them. Not wanting to disappoint the Queen while also recognizing the region's potential for establishing a foothold in the New World, Raleigh launched a second expedition in 1587, appointing John White as its leader, entrusting him with the task of governing the new settlement. Over 100 colonists set sail, not soldiers this time, but ordinary men, women, and children, all hoping to build a new life. White also brought his pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias Dare. The plan? Establish the city of Raleigh in Chesapeake Bay. However, White had planned to first make contact with the 15 men left on Roanoke Island before continuing to their intended destination, Chesapeake Bay. After arriving, the pilot of their flagship, Simon Fernandez, flatly refused to sail any further, citing the shifting seasons and the risks to his return voyage. Experts believe Fernandez's impatience stemmed partly from his past as a privateer, a lucrative career he was eager to resume, especially with tensions between England and Spain on the rise. White protested, but it was no use. It was July 1587 when John White and the other settlers set foot on Roanoke Island, expecting to find a foothold for their new colony. Instead, they were met with silence. The settlement lay in ruins, cabins weathered and overgrown, every sign of life erased by time or perhaps something far more sinister. And the 15 men Grenville had left behind? Gone. No bodies, no graves, not even a trace of a struggle. But one macabre clue remained: a lone sun-bleached skeleton. Was it one of the men abandoned to die? A warning left behind for those who dared to follow? No one could say. One thing was certain: the 15 lost souls became the first whispers in the ever-growing mystery of Roanoke. Despite the unsettling discovery, White, now officially governor of Roanoke, had no choice but to make the best of their situation. The settlement was rebuilt, but there was another problem. The previous colonists had left behind more than just abandoned buildings and a pile of bones. Tensions with the island's indigenous tribes that were simmering and about to boil over. During this time, 4 Native American tribes inhabited the Roanoke region. The one John White needed to find was the CROATOANs, the only group that had maintained a relatively friendly relationship with the English. If anyone could provide him with information or supplies, it was them. That said, it was in the colonists' best interest to avoid crossing paths with other tribes, specifically the Socotan, Aquascagok, and the Desamingpunka. Relations with the Socotan had collapsed after Governor Raleigh Lane's aggressive tactics led to the killing of their chief, turning them into staunch enemies. As for the Aquascagok, well, their relationship with the English was doomed from the first attempt at settling. Tensions boiled over when the settlers accused them of stealing a silver cup, a crime that, in their eyes, warranted burning down an entire village after the residents evacuated. Stealing? Bad. But wiping out an entire community over it? Not exactly appropriate reaction. Colonists weren't known for being fair in their reactions, of course. White attempted to navigate these tensions carefully. At first, he managed to establish contact with one of the few friendly groups left, a Croatoan sub-tribe led by Chief Manteo. The chief only had grim news, though. The 15 men left behind had been attacked and killed by warriors from the Socotan, Aquascagok, and Desamingpunko tribes, further destabilizing the already fragile balance between the island's divided factions. Tragedy struck when one of the colonists, George Howe, was found dead, killed by a native while searching for crabs alone along the shore. White was certain the culprit belonged to the Desamingpunka tribe. At this point, the colony was at a severe disadvantage. Caution and careful planning should have been the first course of action, but White had other ideas, lending to his reputation as a poor leader later on. Rather than strategizing, he led his men in a preemptive strike, launching a vengeful assault on a Dasamingponka tribe. There was just one problem. The Dasamingponka had anticipated retaliation and abandoned the village, vanishing into the wilderness before White and his men arrived. So who did the enraged colonists, blinded by vengeance, actually attack? A group of CROATOANs caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, looting the empty village, unaware they were about to be mistaken for the enemy. In a single disastrous move, White fractured their fragile alliance with the only friendly Native American tribe on the island. Fortunately, Chief Monteo remained loyal to the English, stepping in as a mediator to mend relations, at least to some extent. But even with his efforts, tensions lingered, supplies dwindled, and the colonists found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. And as history would soon show, their troubles were far from over. It wasn't all gloom and doom for the Roanoke colonists, though. At around this time, Eleanor gave birth to her daughter, Virginia Dare, who would go on record as the first European child born in North America. Certainly a symbol of a changing world, for better or for worse. Just a month after arriving on Roanoke, the colonists found themselves teetering on the edge of survival. With their hopes of aid from native tribes all but extinguished, their food and supplies depleted at an alarming rate. In the end, perhaps because he was the only one with authority to report back to Raleigh in England, or perhaps because of his faltering leadership, the settlers persuaded White to return to England to get help and supplies. He resisted at first. The idea of leaving his family, of abandoning the colony he was assigned to lead, felt wrong, but the reality of their situation left no room for hesitation. If they did nothing, starvation would surely finish what the environment had already begun. And so, reluctantly, he set sail for England, vowing to return as soon as possible. However, promises made on land will always be at the mercy of the unpredictable tide of the sea. White set sail for England with Fernandez, the pilot, who had been waiting just offshore while the colonists uploaded their supplies and rebuilt the settlement. Determined to return to Roanoke by 1588, with much-needed provisions and reinforcements, White had every intention of making the journey back swiftly. However, fate had other plans, and he would not set foot on Roanoke again until 1590. To be fair, the delay wasn't White's fault. By the time he arrived in England and began gathering supplies, the Anglo-Spanish War had reached a boiling point. The Atlantic was a battlefield, making travel dangerous for both sides. Any hope of contacting the colony or even getting news of their status was next to impossible. Due to the rising tension between the two nations, Queen Elizabeth I ordered all ships to remain at port in the event that they were needed to repel the Spanish Armada. While there were conspiracies stating that Queen Elizabeth deliberately stalled the return to Roanoke to spite Raleigh, White's patron, this is improbable, as both he and the Queen were on good terms during this period. So much so that rumors even swindled that the two were involved in an affair. However, in the ruthless world of the Tudor court, one wrong step could mean ruin. And in 1592, Raleigh took that step. As for White, he attempted to return in the spring of 1588, accompanied by a few colonists aboard two smaller vessels. However, their journey was abruptly cut short when they were attacked by French ships. White himself sustained multiple injuries, including a rather unfortunate bullet wound to the buttocks, not exactly the kind of battle scar one boasts about. The ship was heavily damaged, leaving them no choice but to retreat back to England. From there, the waters of the Atlantic only grew more turbulent, in more ways than one. With war brewing between England and Spain, White found himself trapped in a waiting game, and wait he did for 3 long, agonizing years. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, White was on his way back. He was able to find some privateers who would bring him to Roanoke along with supplies. He had left with a promise of a swift return, and now, as Roanoke's familiar shape emerged on the horizon, anxiety gnawed at him. What would the colonists think or say after his delayed return? Then, smoke. A thin, ghostly wisp rising into the sky. 3 years of silence, and now, at last, a sign. Someone was out there, watching, waiting for salvation. But when White and his crew made landfall, the smell of burning filled the air. They could see the bright flames of a wildfire through the forest. The smoke wasn't from the colonists, their first sign of trouble. White's heart pounded, his vision narrowed. The gnawing dread that had lingered in his mind for years now took full hold. As they made their way toward the settlement and away from the fire, the crew listened intently for any sign of life. Each step was excruciating. Only the rustling leaves, the distant crash of waves, and the occasional chatter from the landing crew. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken truth. Then they saw it. The settlement was gone. No bustling colony, no welcoming party. The houses White had helped build, dismantled. In their place was a crude fort, its rough-hewn walls stark against the lifeless backdrop. And then, the most haunting clue of all, carved into a wooden pillar, was a single word, CROATOAN. Nearby, on a tree, only 3 letters, C-R-O, as if the person who had been carving it had been writing the previous message, only to be suddenly interrupted. Relatively fresh sets of footprints could also be found in the outskirts of the settlement, most likely left by one of the Native American tribes that lived nearby. It was unlikely it was made by colonists due to how dilapidated the state of the fort was. It had been abandoned for quite some time. Whether these tracks were made by a friendly or hostile tribe, that was the real question. White's mind raced. Had the colony been attacked? If so, where were the bodies, the ruins, the signs and remnants of a battle? No. The scene didn't fit the narrative of an attack. At least that's what he believed. This was planned. Everything was in order, except for one glaring fact. The colonists were gone. His only clue, the name CROATOAN, the home and name of a Native American tribe that had been friendly to English settlers. At the time of White's return to England 3 years ago, the relationship between the settlers and members of the CROATOANs were still relatively amicable, despite the tragic events that transpired. Could it be that the colonists had relocated there, seeking safety from Roanoke's growing hostilities? Or was the message a warning? And why hadn't they left more information? White needed to find out. But fate had other plans. White and his crew arrived just as typhoon season struck. The sky darkened, a storm brewing on the horizon. Fearing they'd be stranded, the crew refused to stay on the island any more than necessary. White had no choice but to return to the ship, haunted by an unanswered question that hurt the most. What had happened to his daughter and granddaughter he had left behind? Back on the ship, White clung to one last hope. The colony might have relocated to CROATOAN Island. He convinced 2 captains to sail there the next day, once the weather improved. But the ill-fated Roanoke expedition seemed cursed to the very end. One ship lost its anchor and nearly ran aground. The other captain persuaded White to sail for the Caribbean instead, promising they would return once better prepared. White, in yet another moment of poor leadership, agreed. But once in the Caribbean, the crew abandoned the mission entirely, joining an English privateer. White was left stranded, unable to return to Roanoke. What he did afterwards remains largely unknown, as he slowly faded away from public view. Meanwhile, in England, Raleigh shifted his focus from North America to Ireland after the Anglo-Spanish War, diverting most of England's naval efforts and funds there. During this period, Raleigh also fell out of favor with Queen Elizabeth I after marrying one of her ladies-in-waiting without approval. This led to his arrest and imprisonment in the Tower of London. Thus, any hope of a future expedition to Roanoke was put on hold indefinitely. In 1602, Raleigh gained back the Queen's favor and was freed. He decided to investigate the lost colony of Roanoke himself, funding a ship and crew to be led by Samuel Mace from his own pocket. But just as the crew reached the region, a severe storm forced them to turn back to England. Cursed, remember? Unfortunately for Raleigh, he was met with yet another imprisonment around this time for treason against the newly crowned King James I. Though he avoided execution, he spent the next 13 years behind bars. Upon his release, King James I sent him on a mission to find the legendary City of Gold, El Dorado. But once again, fate was unkind. The expedition failed, and Raleigh's men attacked a Spanish outpost, violating the peace treaty between England and Spain. The Spanish demanded justice, and upon his return to England, Raleigh was imprisoned once more, this time being the last. In 1618, he was executed by order of King James I. Another attempt to uncover the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke was made in 1603. A fact-finding mission led by Bartholomew Gilbert sailed back to Roanoke Island. But like the others before it, this expedition ended not just in failure, but in tragedy. Gilbert's ship was battered by powerful storms, forcing them off course. Stranded at Delaware Bay, still hundreds of miles from their intended destination, the crew faced an even greater threat, an ambush by Native Americans. Few survived. Gilbert didn't. Those who did managed to make it back to England, exhausted, defeated, and no closer to uncovering the fate of the lost Roanoke colonists. As for John White, he passed away in 1606, 16 years after his fateful return to Roanoke, where he found the colony abandoned and its settlers missing. Whether he died in England or Ireland, no one knows for certain, but he died never knowing what happened to the people, nor his daughter and her child he left behind on that faraway island. And so, the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke faded into history, unanswered. But if you need answers and a good lawyer to find them, Morgan & Morgan, this video's sponsor, has you covered. If you're ever seriously hurt, your injury could be worth millions. A Morgan & Morgan case in Florida ended in a settlement of $12 million, which is 34 times the highest insurance offer. And in Philadelphia, another case went home with 40 times the highest insurance offer at $26 million. And that was only within the last couple of months for victims involved in life-altering car crashes. They don't settle for lowball offers. Instead, if you become their client, they will fight to get you what you deserve. And you don't even have to pay them unless you win. So if you ever get seriously injured, your case could be worth millions, and you're only a few clicks away from potentially changing your life. It's so easy. You can start your claim now with Morgan & Morgan at forthepeople.com/brew, found in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen from your phone's camera. And thank you, Morgan & Morgan, for sponsoring today's video. Over the years, whispers of Roanoke's fate have only grown louder. What started as a vanished colony in a wild, untamed land soon turned into the stuff of legends. From historical records to eerie folklore, countless theories have emerged, some grounded in evidence, others dipping into the supernatural. So, what really happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? Let's dive into the juicier, wilder theories first, the ones that venture far beyond logic and into the realm of the supernatural. But if you're a fan of myths, legends, and cryptozoology, you might just find them fascinating. Although I'm more of a Dana Scully type, for the sake of considering all possibilities, let's dive into the kind of theories that Fox Mulder would undeniably subscribe to. First of all, what's the one infamous theory thrown around in mysterious disappearances? That one explanation that always seems to come up when people vanish without a trace, or abducted? Yes, of course. Aliens. Yes, some believe the Roanoke colonists were taken by beings from another world. Literally. Of course, there's no concrete evidence, but that hasn't stopped people from speculating that the colonists have been whisked away and are now among the stars, light years away. Definitely farther than what they originally signed up for. Another theory suggests the settlers fell under the influence of an evil entity. Some say they were punished for trespassing on land without permission. According to CROATOAN beliefs, a spirit of the island could absorb people into the landscape, transforming them into trees, animals, or stone. Were the colonists consumed by the very land they hoped to use for their own gain? You have to admit, that is an ironic end for colonizers. There's another one that involves a well-known Native American mythology. Around bonfires at night, tribes whispered of a terrifying spirit, the Wendigo. Legend says this spirit takes over those who commit cannibalism, turning them into twisted, inhuman creatures cursed with eternal hunger. If the colonists, in their desperation, resorted to eating one another when they faced starvation, did they unknowingly curse themselves to roam the land forever as Wendigos? A chilling thought. Especially the cannibalism part, as that is a more plausible scenario. And now, my personal favorite, the zombie plague theory. This theory stems from two things: the possibility of cannibalism and an unknown disease. What if a mysterious plague turned the settlers into mindless, flesh-hungry creatures? No bodies were found, so maybe, just maybe, the settlement was picked clean by the infected. Andre Freeman of the Zombie Research Society, and yes, that's a thing apparently, says, a sudden undead plague sweeping through the unprepared colony would quickly become a horrific, violent feast, leaving not a single man, woman, or child alive. Whether you imagine them as slow Ramiro zombies or rage-fueled 28 Days Later monsters, I'll leave that up to you. But admit it, this theory would make an incredible period piece horror movie. Folklore and urban legends may not give us concrete answers, or much of anything beyond entertainment for that matter, but it's hard to blame paranormal enthusiasts for throwing their hat in the ring in a case this mysterious. But what about theories of the normal variety? Some have suggested that the Roanoke colonists, tired of waiting for rescue, may have attempted to sail back to England on their own. But such a dangerous voyage across the Atlantic required a seaworthy vessel, something they didn't have. At best, they could have cobbled together a makeshift boat from salvaged materials, but even that would have been a desperate gamble. However, desperate people often take desperate measures. If they did set sail, the odds were not in their favor. While smaller vessels do travel over vast distances, they are often escorted by larger ships. A violent storm could have easily wrecked their fragile craft, or worse, they may have fallen prey to a passing Spanish warship. While intriguing, this theory lacks any solid evidence. No shipwrecks, no survivor accounts. Continuing the theory that the Roanoke colonists met a tragic end, another possibility is that they fell victim to a Spanish attack, but on land this time. England and Spain were at war during the 3 years that White was away. Could a passing Spanish patrol ship have discovered the Roanoke colony? With Spanish garrisons stationed in Florida at the time, it's not far-fetched to think they might have detected the English settlement during their patrols. Spanish forces had a history of targeting rival colonies, having already attacked English forts in South Carolina and Florida. If they had found Roanoke, Would they have wiped it out as well? But here's the problem. One major clue puts a hole in this theory. Remember when White returned in 1590? He noted that the settlement was dismantled, not destroyed. That suggests a deliberate and organized departure, not an attack or raid. Even more telling, the Spanish were still searching for Roanoke in 1600, long after the colony had disappeared. So if it wasn't war and it wasn't a massacre, what really happened? The secret operation at Beachland theory suggests the lost colony of Roanoke may not have been lost at all. Instead, some believe Sir Walter Raleigh had a hidden motive. Was the Roanoke colony a covert operation disguised as a failed settlement? What if Roanoke wasn't about survival, but about sassafras? Back in the late 1500s, this medicinal plant grown in North America was worth nearly as much as gold. It was a miracle cure-all, claiming to do everything from helping with bruises to curing many ailments like syphilis and the measles. However, it didn't actually do much other than a few minor medical benefits, like as a fever reducer. Plus, it's highly carcinogenic, which means it can give you cancer. Darkly ironic because it was once believed to prevent cancer. But they obviously didn't know this. That's why engineer Philip McMullen and amateur archaeologist Fred Willard argue that Raleigh secretly moved the colonists near the Alligator River, away from prying eyes, to cultivate and harvest the valuable crop. According to this theory, official records about the colony's intended location and its supposed disappearance were intentionally falsified. Why? To throw off Spanish spies and rival English investors. In short, greed. Another tinder to this fire are local legends in Dare County, North Carolina, about an abandoned settlement called Beachland, hidden deep in what is now the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. Over the years, reports have emerged about small wooden coffins marked with Christian symbols, buried beneath the soil. Could these be remnants of the so-called lost colony? McMullen suggests that Raleigh never actually lost contact with the settlers. Instead, he believes the colony remained active for decades, with Raleigh's men secretly collecting sassafras. But when Raleigh died in 1618, that connection was severed, leaving the colonists to assimilate with the CROATOAN people of Beachland. Of course, not everyone buys into this theory. Skeptics argue that while Raleigh may have had his eye on the sassafras trade, the real price surge didn't happen until the late 1590s, years after the 1587 colony was established. Plus, privateering efforts by Richard Grenville had already recouped much of Raleigh's financial losses, raising questions about whether a secret operation was necessary at all. So, was Roanoke a doomed settlement or a well-orchestrated deception? The truth may be buried beneath Beachland's soil, still waiting to be uncovered. Another theory surrounding the disappearance of the Roanoke colony? Disease. Could an invisible killer have been the true villain of this story? Take this into consideration. The settlers were strangers to the land, with no immunity to the diseases of this new world. The risk of encountering a deadly plague was high, a silent threat they never saw coming and had no defense against. Now imagine the hardships they were already facing: dwindling supplies, isolation, and an unforgiving environment. Add a deadly disease to the mix and tensions would have reached a breaking point. Panic is a dangerous thing. Could infighting have erupted as settlers disagreed on how to handle the sickness? Did fear drive them to banish the infected? Or did they make the desperate decision to flee, hoping to escape the disease before it wiped them all out? Once again, this theory leads us back to the idea that the Roanoke colonists left the island, but if disease was the reason, their fate may have been even more tragic than we ever imagined. We've talked about the CROATOAN and crow carvings left behind at the abandoned Roanoke settlement, but there's another engraving out there that bears a striking similarity, which is still there today, which leads some to believe is connected to the lost colony. Enter the Cora tree, a towering water oak in Frisco, North Carolina, steeped in both legend and mystery. Locals tell the tale of a young woman named Cora, accused of witchcraft and condemned to a horrific fate. She was tied to the ancient oak and burned, but just as the flames consumed her, lightning struck the tree. When the blinding flash faded, Cora was gone, and in her place, the tree bore her name, carved into the bark. That's the legend, at least, but others believe the Cora inscription has nothing to do with a woman wrongfully accused. Instead, they argue it could have been a colonial shorthand, a way to mark a location or group, much like Crow and CROATOAN. Some researchers have even speculated that the lost colonists of Roanoke carved the name into the tree as part of their trail of messages, a sign of where they had gone. Why do they think this? Because the Cora tree is located on the tip of Hatteras Island, and if you look at old maps, Hatteras Island was formerly known as CROATOAN Island, named after the tribe that lived there, and a possible destination for the colonists. It is speculation as there's no further evidence, but this does lead us to the next theory. The most popular theory is that the colonists didn't vanish but assimilated into Native American tribes, particularly the CROATOAN. Reports have surfaced over the years of Native Americans in the region with distinctly European features, lighter skin, blue or gray eyes, even blonde hair. Could these people be the descendants of Roanoke's lost settlers? Adding weight to this story, English explorer John Lawson recorded an encounter in 1709 with Croatoans who claimed to have English ancestors from Roanoke Island. He also noted that some had striking gray eyes, an unusual trait among Native Americans. Further supporting this idea, William Strachey, the first secretary of the Jamestown colony, wrote that 20 years after Roanoke's disappearance, reports suggested the settlers had joined the Chesapeake tribe and lived peacefully among them for 2 decades. However, apparently it wasn't made to last. Chief Powhatan, the dominant ruler of the region, and father to the famous Native American historical figure, Pocahontas, allegedly ordered the massacre of their rival, the Chesapeake, which unfortunately included the alleged English settlers living with the tribe at the time. Strachey even mentioned rumors of 7 English survivors, including a young woman. Could that young woman have been Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World? Based on the timeline, she would have been the right age. If so, what became of the survivors? Some believe the colonists, or at least the few who escaped Powhatan's wrath, fled inland. In support of this theory, a paper company in the 1950s accidentally excavated coffins near the Alligator River. Each coffin looked more like 2 canoes put together, one on the bottom, one flipped and put on top, and each one featuring Christian symbols. They were buried out of respect. This strongly suggests the English settlers lived there. But here's the kicker. There's no official record of an English settlement in that area. However, many residents in that area were always told by their parents and their parents' parents that they were descendants of those who fled Roanoke. In 2007, the Lost Colony of Roanoke DNA project, founded by Robert Estes, set out to solve one of history's greatest mysteries. The project invited Native Americans who believed they were descendants of the lost Roanoke colonists to take DNA tests, analyzing autosomal DNA, Y chromosomes, and mitochondrial DNA for any genetic links. While the results have shown some promising leads, as of 2025, no definitive connections have been confirmed. However, there's potentially more evidence of this theory being true. In 1937, Lewis Hammond, a tourist from California traveling through Edenton, North Carolina, was enjoying a leisurely stroll along a hiking trail when he spotted something unusual, a stone jutting out from the water. Curious, he took a closer look and discovered inscriptions carved into its surface. Among them were several names and a date, 1591. Intrigued, Hammond retrieved the stone and brought it to Emory University, placing it in the hands of experts. It would come to be known as the Chowan River Stone. Written on this stone is Old English. Translated, it reads, Ananias Dare and Virginia went hence unto heaven, 1591. Any Englishman show this rock to John White, governor of Virginia. On the back of the stone was a description, also in Old English, of what the writer and their group went through. It translates to, Father, soon after you go for England, we came here, only misery and war for 2 years. Above half dead these 2 years, more from sickness, being 24. A savage with a message of a ship came to us. Within a small space of time, they became frightened of revenge and ran all away. We believe it was not you. Soon after, the savages said spirits were angry. Suddenly, they murdered all save 7. My child, and Ananias too, were slain with much misery. Buried all near 4 miles east of this river, upon a small hill. Names were written all there on a rock. Put this there also. If a savage shows this to you, we promised you would give them great plenty presents. The stone describes sickness and war and the location of where some of the settlers who perished after an attack by a group of natives were buried, a burial ground that has yet to be discovered. At the very end of the text were 3 letters that connect this stone carved with pain and sadness to the lost colony of Roanoke. EWD, Eleanor White Dare. Could this really have been made by the daughter of John White? The writing style aligned with the era, and the stone's worn markings seemed to point to its considerable age, drawing historians deeper into its mystery. For years, debate raged over its authenticity. History professor Dr. Haywood J. Pierce Jr. was so convinced of the stone's authenticity that he offered a $500 reward, about $11,400 in today's money, for anyone who could find the second stone, which was hinted by the first stone to be there, a discovery that had the potential to finally unravel the mystery of what happened to the Roanoke colonists. And then, more Dare stones began to appear. The next of the alleged Dare stones were brought forth by Bill Eberhart, a stonecutter from Fulton County, Georgia. In the summer of 1939, he claimed to have found the long-lost second Dare stone. This time around, the carving detailed the names of 17 deceased English colonists. He said he had discovered it near Pelzer, South Carolina, and even took the Pierces to the site for proof. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Eberhard didn't stop at one stone. In fact, he handed over 13 more, all supposedly found in the same area. And then, the floodgates opened. By the time he was done, Eberhard had provided the Pierces with a grand total of 42 stones. According to these supposed relics, the surviving Roanoke colonists had journeyed southwest to Edenton, North Carolina, through South Carolina, and into Georgia. Eleanor Dare and 6 survivors allegedly found refuge with friendly Cherokees in a place called Honteos. There, Eleanor supposedly married a Native American chief in 1593 and gave birth to their daughter, Agnes. However, this union was allegedly not supported by the other members of the tribe, and Eleanor was forced to flee. It is noted in one of these stones that she eventually died in 1599 and buried in a cave along the Chattahoochee River, near what is now Atlanta. A compelling story? Absolutely. A true one? Not so much. At first glance, the stone seemed like a window into the lost world of the Roanoke colonists, but something was off. Linguist experts quickly spotted anachronisms, words and phrases that had no place in Elizabethan English. The more they examined the carvings, the more the cracks in the story began to show. And then, the veil of deception finally fell. Every single Dare stone presented by Eberhard was exposed as a forgery. In hindsight, the fact that he was a stonecutter should have set off alarm bells from the start. His imaginative contributions to history earned him around $2,000, a small fortune at the time. A few more stones surfaced, courtesy of his associates, but under scrutiny, they crumbled just as easily. But if nothing else, Eberhard proved that the Lost Colony mystery wasn't just a historical enigma, it was also an irresistible fruit to pick for hoaxers. This is not to say that the first one, the Chowan River Stone, was irrefutable proof, as some experts do have some questions that poke holes in its validity. One glaring issue was the use of Roman letters, which, at the time, only the well-educated would use. Most English in the 1500s implemented Gothic script when writing. Then again, who's to say what educational attainment Eleanor had? Then, in 2016, scientists at the University of North Carolina conducted a detailed analysis. When they tested samples of the first stone, the results were striking. Beneath its weathered exterior, the freshly exposed interior gleamed in stark contrast to the darkened, eroded engravings. The deep patina and significant wear on the inscription suggested that this carving had endured the relentless passage of centuries, possibly dating it to the 1500s. While such weathering can be achieved with the use of chemicals, that technology is deemed too advanced to be achieved back when the stone was discovered in 1937. And so, we are left with one possible link to the lost colony. Further testing is needed to confirm its authenticity, but for now, this puzzle piece somewhat aligns with the most widely accepted theory behind this centuries-old mystery: relocation and integration with the indigenous people of the region. John White, with the help of a few others like mathematician and astronomer Thomas Harriot, created what's known as the most careful, detailed piece of cartography for any part of North America to be made in the 16th century, called La Virginia Pars. It was a map of the east coast of Virginia and North Carolina, which included Roanoke Island. Strangely, there were 2 patches on the map, one over Beaufort and the surrounding areas, and one at the convergence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers. In 2012, the British Museum used X-ray spectroscopy and advanced light imaging technology to look under those patches. The first patch was a typical correction. It wasn't uncommon to use patches to fix maps, as creating ones with this much detail was labor-intensive. Redrawing the map wasn't ideal. The second, however, uncovered something unexpected: a star-shaped symbol, colored red and blue. These types of symbols usually depict some sort of fort. Not only that, but on top of the patch, it's revealed there are faint lines of the same symbol, but smaller. But it's not visible unless you know what to look for. First, it could have been visible upon first creating the map, a simple correction of the far too large fort symbol underneath. Over time, it is simply worn out. But let's look at the fort's location. It's right in the heart of Roanoke territory, who were known for their friendly relations with settlers. The site lies in what is now Bertie County, North Carolina. Given their dire circumstances, it would have been logical for the stranded Roanoke colonists to seek refuge in an area where allies lived, a place John White himself knew well and likely shared with others before his fateful departure. Which brings us to the second theory, which is that it's made of invisible ink, which was common practice at the time. Some suggest it was to keep this information from getting into foreign hands, like the Spanish. Regardless of why, this site became known as Site X, and the First Colony Foundation became very interested in it. In 2007, they began excavating Site X, and to their astonishment, they uncovered centuries-old English pottery and other colonial-era artifacts, alongside Native American relics. These findings suggest a blended community, a strong indication about the theory that at least some Roanoke settlers may have integrated with the tribe. But Site X wasn't the only breakthrough. Another key location emerged, the Elizabethan Gardens in Monteo, once the Algonquin village of Roanoke. This indigenous settlement, also connected to the English, caught researchers' attention in 2023 when they unearthed Algonquin pottery dating back to the 1500s, along with something intriguing, a copper wire. While Native Americans were skilled metalworkers, Dr. Eric Klingelhofer, a historian and archaeologist who has played a significant role in the search for the lost colony of Roanoke, pointed out that this wire had rounded strands, something beyond indigenous metalworking techniques of the time. The only group capable of producing and trading such an object in that region and era? The English. The village is located not too far from the original colonist site, now referred to as Fort Raleigh, so it's no big surprise to find traded items there. However, it further supports the idea of integration with the local Native Americans. Perhaps they even lived there for a time. Nothing could be certain, and the First Colony Foundation is continuing investigations at Site X and the newly discovered village at Elizabethan Gardens. But there is one final nail in the coffin. Literally, metalwork is the key to unlocking what happened to the settlers, because recently, archaeologists have discovered something called hammer scale. Where? On Hatteras Island, formerly CROATOAN Island, the same place where the CROATOAN tribe lived, the same place where the Cora tree lives, and the same place that was marked into the wooden post as a clue on Roanoke Island. But what is hammer scale? You see, when a blacksmith places an iron rod into the forge and takes it out while it's red hot, and they smash into it with a hammer, those flecks of metal that fly off, they call that hammer scale. So this wasn't just trading metal items. The English blacksmiths worked there and probably lived there. Scott Dawson, the president of the CROATOAN Archaeological Society, who also runs the Lost Colony Museum located on Hatteras Island, said, "This is showing a presence of the English working metal and living in the Indian village for decades. We're finding this whole metalworking workshop on the site and natives didn't do that." So, is that it then? Has it finally been solved? Going through the available clues that we have gathered and incorporating some deducting skills, one particular picture does materialize. Let's go over the evidence that we have, shall we? First, there were the CROATOAN and Crow carvings, the cryptic messages left behind by the missing colonists. John White and his settlers had agreed that if they abandoned the colony under duress, they would carve a cross symbol alongside any message, but no such mark was found. Instead, the colony was eerily deserted, with no signs of struggle or violence. This strongly suggests that the settlers had left willingly, like seeking refuge with the CROATOAN tribe. Then came the Dare Stone, at least the first one, which many experts consider authentic. If its message was to be believed, the journey away from Roanoke had been anything but easy. The stone painted a grim picture of illness, starvation, bloody conflict, and death. Eleanor Dare's desperate account didn't just hint at hardship, it all but confirmed it. Yet, what if, despite all the suffering, some of the colonists did manage to reach safety? That's where Site X and the Elizabethan Gardens come into play. Archaeologists unearthed English relics from the 1500s in both locations, evidence that at least some of the settlers had integrated and traveled inland. The fact that these findings appeared in separate places suggested another intriguing possibility. The colonists may not have stayed together. Whether they were split up intentionally or were forced apart by circumstances remains unknown. But one thing is clear, they didn't vanish without a trace. And then there were the reports of Native Americans with European features such as light eyes and blonde hair, centuries after the colony's disappearance. Oral histories told of indigenous tribes with ancestors who spoke of white forebears. Could these have been the lost settlers of Roanoke? DNA research is still ongoing, but early results have shown promise, inching us closer to the truth. And then, of course, the final piece of the puzzle. On Hatteras Island, hammer scale, evidence of metalworking techniques that the Native Americans didn't have, plus several other artifacts like weapons, a metal Tudor rose emblem of English royalty, and a coin that looks European, all points to one thing. It seems the colonists assimilated into Native American tribes, some perishing along the way due to disease or conflict, while others survived, intermarried, and became part of the land they once sought to claim. In fact, this mystery isn't very mysterious anymore. Scott Dawson explained, "They say that the colony vanished and they left behind this cryptic message on a tree, CROATOAN, and no one knows what it means. But CROATOAN is Hatteras Island. It's clearly labeled on the maps." He also stated, "The Lost Colony is a marketing campaign that started in 1937 and it created this myth of a colony that vanished and none of that is real." So I'm confident to say that this mystery is, once and for all, not a mystery. but it does make for a good story. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel, as it really helps us to keep bringing more stories to you, like this one about how the internet hunted down the 2 anonymous Domino's employees who terrorized America with their sickening videos.